and welcome to my channel, Shar Sews. Today we'll be going through how to add Sashiko stitching onto your me-made garment, which is what I've got right here. I was initially drawn to Sashiko stitching for its beauty, the contrasting colors, and the overall intricate designs that you can make, and I thought, why not try something new? I've never done Sashiko stitching before, and I've documented my process to share with you guys, and hopefully it inspires you guys to try something new as well.
Sashiko is a type of traditional Japanese stitching, and it was first applied to clothing out of a practical need to reinforce or patch fabric.
I think it's really important to be aware of the cultural and historical significance of Sashiko stitching before one gets started on a project. I've done a lot of research on my own, and I am by no means an expert. I would recommend checking out the YouTube channel Sashiko Story, which I've linked in the description below, to gain a better understanding of that cultural and historical significance and what it means to practice Sashiko mindfully. I would also love to give a shout out to Geri In Stitches. I've linked her YouTube channel, blog posts, and website in the description below. Geri's original blog post on how to incorporate Sashiko stitching into the Ashton top is what I used as inspiration to create this video. So this is the Ashton top. I've incorporated Sashiko stitching in much the same way that she has outlined in her blog post. So thank you, Geri, for sharing that knowledge, and you have been the inspiration for making this video.
Before we begin, we must choose an appropriate garment, and there are several things to consider. The first thing to consider is whether your garment has a facing or a lining. I would recommend doing your Sashiko stitching on an area of your garment that has a facing or lining because it provides a visual barrier from your stitches showing on the wrong side of the fabric. The next thing to consider is how easy the garment is to construct. We really want to focus on creating a Sashiko design and not be bogged down in the construction of our garment. Finally, we want a garment that has clean lines. And what I mean by that is that it has minimal embellishments because we want to focus on the stitching and not have any visual clutter with our garment. The Ashton top by Helen's Closet met all the criteria and therefore was used for this project.
You can definitely approach a Sashiko project with the existing tools that you would have on hand from your existing sewing or embroidery projects. However, there are some specific Sashiko tools that will actually make your life much easier and provide more authenticity to the approach that you're taking.
You'll need to pick out a fabric for your project. I would recommend something durable and sturdy. Here I have a 100% cotton navy fabric that I'm using. We just want to make sure that the fabric is going to be able to withstand the stitching that we're going to be doing to it. Next, we have our Sashiko thread. If you don't have Sashiko thread, you could use embroidery thread as a substitute. However, it is definitely not the same. Sashiko thread is much thicker and coarser, has a very distinct texture, and it also gives you that iconic Sashiko look when you're doing your stitching. So this is one thing where if you have the ability to obtain Sashiko thread, please do so. Otherwise, you could certainly practice the techniques with a different type of thread. We also want to pick a thread color that provides a nice contrast to our fabric color choice. So here, since I've got an indigo navy type fabric, I'm going with a traditional white thread to contrast, but you can use any kind of contrasting thread to achieve your desired effect. Next, we have some kind of marking tools. There are so many different types of marking tools out there. I am just using a tailor's pencil and tailor's chalk. Those were the cheapest that I could find, and I already had it in my stash. So no need to go out and buy anything too fancy. If you have more fancy things, go for it, but you really just need something to be able to mark onto your fabric and have it wash away. A ruler is needed in order to mark our straight lines when we create a grid pattern. Alternatively, some people use graph paper or Choco paper to transfer line markings onto their garment. I didn't have either of these things, so I'm going to be using a ruler to draw my grid. And finally, we'll need a pair of snips and our Sashiko needle. A Sashiko needle is definitely necessary to complete this project. They're much longer than general purpose needles. It has an elongated eye, and the length of the needle really helps support the techniques that we're doing with the running stitches.
The type of stitching that we're going to be doing specifically is called hitomizashi. This is where we're going to be using a grid to help inform where we're going to place our running stitches. So we're just going to be doing rows of vertical and horizontal running stitches that might intersect at various points, but we're going to be using a grid to help inform what we're doing. This is in contrast to other types of stitching where we might make a design or draw some clouds or make a rainbow, and that's a little bit too complicated for me at this point in time. So as a beginner, I decided to stick with the grid method.
First, we need to decide which pattern pieces we want to have our Sashiko stitching on. I've chosen both the front and the back pieces, but you're welcome to choose whichever pattern piece that you like. Next, we want to finish all of our raw edges to avoid fraying and sew any details like darts. The next step is to just draw in our seam allowances, and this will help us when we go to create our design to make sure that we don't get too close to the edge. We now need to start thinking about the placement of our grid. I've chosen to keep my grid area that I'm going to work on within the facing or lining of my front piece. This is the area where I'm going to contain the pattern to make sure that the underside of my stitches will be concealed by the facing or lining. The same concept holds for the back piece, where I'll be containing the area that we're going to stitch on within the bounds of the back lining. Finally, our last step in the preparation process is to draw in our grid. We're looking for 5mm by 5mm squares, and I've done this by just taking my ruler and drawing straight vertical and horizontal lines across the garment within the bounds that I've drawn previously to create a grid. We're going to use our grid to create 4 distinct patterns without the use of a template. The first is a cross stitch. The second is a rice stitch. Next, we have a variation on the rice stitch. And then finally, another variation of the rice stitch. Now we're finally ready to get stitching. Make a knot in your Sashiko thread. Any knot will do, a quilter's knot or just a regular knot. The entire foundation of our Sashiko stitching will be a straight running stitch. So along our entire grid, we are going to be doing rows and rows of horizontal running stitches. Here you can see that I'm using the grid points, so the points where the vertical and horizontal lines intersect, to weave my Sashiko needle up and down, all the way across the garment. This is where the length of the Sashiko needle comes in handy, where you can just do an entire very long running stitch. Here I'm pushing it through the fabric, just orienting myself so you guys can see, and then pulling the entire needle and thread through. Once you've pulled the thread all the way through, you want to make sure that you ease the fabric and make sure that the tension on all of those stitches remains the same throughout the garment, so we don't want any puckering. Importantly, you'll notice that I actually stagger the horizontal stitches so that in each row we're alternating where we're showing the running stitches. This is really important because it forms the foundation of our design. Here I've highlighted exactly what I mean, so you can see that we've got a stagger going on here. You might notice that it's actually quite difficult to maintain the right tension on your running stitches as you move from row to row. Something that I found very helpful is, as you go from one row to the next, to leave larger loops on the back side of the garment, just to make sure that there's some ease. If something goes wrong with the tension, you can easily fix each row. Here's another look at what I mean by leaving some larger loops on the back side. And this is what it looks like once all your running stitches have been completed. You can see that I've also done my best to make sure that the running stitches are maintained within the original area of the pattern that I intended. So our first stitch was a horizontal running stitch that we did across our entire garment. To do a cross stitch, we will be doing running stitches again. However, we will be going in the opposite direction and trying to catch our existing running stitches in a cross shape. So what I'm doing here is my needle is going up, down, and we are aiming for the middle of the squares now, not where the lines intersect. By aiming for the middle of the squares, when we go up and down, we can cross over the existing running stitches to make a cross. Here you can see that my needle is firmly crossed over the areas where we want, and as I pull through the thread, we have nice even crosses that result. And once again, you got to make sure that you're managing the tension of your threads. Now that we have another stitch going over, the fabric can get warped, so we want to make sure that with each row that we're doing, we straighten out the fabric. Here are my cross stitches across the entire front piece. All the remaining stitches will use the cross stitch as the base. For the rice stitch, we will start with our original cross stitch and then connect all of these crosses on a diagonal using a straight running stitch. We'll do all the diagonals in one direction first and then change directions and do the next direction. So here we can see I've pulled through the thread and now we're going to be connecting each of the crosses at the base. Once again, make sure to smooth out the fabric and make sure the tension on the stitches is correct. Here we can see how my needle has threaded in between all of the crosses to get a good idea of sort of what we're trying to go for when we pull through our needle and thread to create that nice straight line. This is what it looks like once all your diagonals in one direction have been completed. So now we're going to be doing the same process just in the opposite direction. Once that's all done, you can see the development of our rice stitch on the right hand side of our front piece here. For this rice stitch variation, the goal is to place each of our crosses inside a box. So what I'm doing here is I'm starting by doing straight running stitches beside each of our crosses, and I'm using the length or the height of each of our crosses as a guide as to where to put my stitch. Something important to note that I found out after the fact is that since we're using our existing crosses as the guide to place our stitches, if your crosses are uneven in size, then your running stitches on the outside will also appear uneven or in varied lengths. So after we finish up here, you'll see that the overall look is a little bit messy, and that's strictly due to the fact that my crosses weren't as even as they could be, which kind of resulted in everything being a little bit skewed. Once you've completed the running stitches in one direction, we once again go in the other direction. So the end result will be that our crosses should be contained within a box of running stitches. So here's the end result of these stitches. Definitely a little bit wonky looking. That's definitely due to some lapses in concentration and also varied sizes in the original cross stitches that were done. Here we've been connecting the crosses on a diagonal, and then whenever I felt like it, I just switched directions to create a cool mountain-like effect. Now that we've completed all of our Sashiko stitching, all that's left is to sew our garment pieces together and create our finished top. I think this is a good visual representation of why I would prefer to have a lining or a facing on the garment that I'm working on for Sashiko stitching. There's a lot of visual clutter with regard to the wrong side of the fabric where we can see the underside of all of our stitches. Also, it's really important to remember if you need to clip into your seams, make sure you do not clip into the actual Sashiko threads or you will ruin the tension of all of your stitches. And this is what our final garment looks like with the facing attached.
Thank you for following me in the Sashiko journey where we created an embroidered top. I definitely had a ton of fun. I still have lots and lots to learn. My technique is far from perfect and I'm excited to learn some new designs. Hopefully you learned something new and are inspired to try something similar. I would love to hear from you. If you have any comments or questions, please leave a comment and subscribe to my channel. Thank you.